Hello and good evening. My name is Bill Forche, and our presentation is entitled Natural and Experiential Systemic Therapy. The acronym for that is NEST. We consider this to be a transcultural approach to family therapy. I assume you've already read the abstract, so I will not be reading that or pursuing it. If you haven't, I would recommend it because it summarizes everything we'll be talking about. Listing here is the preface, is actually a summary of the abstract. So basically, NEST, Natural and Experiential Systemic Therapy, is based on the integration of two otherwise disparate approaches, which I'll be describing and naming in a moment, to facilitating the differentiation of a self, or even the differentiating of a society or a particular culture within the transcultural crucible of an empirically based theory of anxiety, the causes of anxiety and the management thereof. The first of these disparate approaches is called natural systems theory of Murray Bowen. The other is called Relational Gestalt therapy by Gary Yontoff. And the crucible, which we think of as providing a universal rather than a cultural in particular, it's a theory of cultural formation, is terror management theory by a group of social psychologists who wrote a book called Worm at the Core, which provides evidence for Ernst Becker's work, who was a meta-level thinker in the field of cultural anthropology. Here's another way of presenting that. It's the same idea. I'm just providing the slide, but it's exactly the same idea. I'm also presenting a slide. I will not go into it, but Gestalt therapy itself, Gestalt psychology, that is very much about perception and has much in common with postmodernism. And this is Harlene Anderson's 6 postmodern assumptions, which is very much a part of our work and a part of our overall theory. The part I want to focus on is called the human cycle of creativity and the role of wisdom. And I'll be integrating all 3 of these views in this particular part of the program. First of all, anxiety itself is a universal and unavoidable human experience. It comes from the very nature of being a human being, and I'm going to be explaining why in just a moment. This is the cycle of creativity, and is it's the theoretical basis of the integration of natural and experiential systemic therapy of these 2 disparate, is because of this context. Basically, terror management theory, as well as Murray Bowen's theory, postulates these ideas, and I put them together in this particular way that makes sense for me and for our work. The notion is that creativity has been selected in the evolutionary processes because it has survival value. It is embodied mostly in ourselves as a species and Homo sapiens, but not exclusively so. It also exists in other species, but nowhere near like ours. So creativity is thought of as a process that's selected in. The reason for human consciousness being selected in is in order to it's the ground by which creativity occurs. And creativity is simply DNA evolving to the point that any form of DNA, like any species, doesn't just have to adapt to the environment. It actually has the power through creativity of changing the environment to suit its own purposes of survival. And that is what is meant by this. Now, for human beings, any particular act of creativity, which we do all the time, all day long, all of us do, but it has particular properties or characteristics. For one thing, it actualizes the phenomenological experience of freedom. Sometimes that feels very positive and alive and adrenaline secretion and what have you. And sometimes it's very scary and elicits anxiety. Sometimes, and probably most often, both. Because at the same time, when a person actualizes freedom, that is, they're aware of themselves in space and time where they are, time is going by, even if time is an illusion, it's experience is going by. And in doing so, they experience themselves suddenly as an individual, apart from all others, because they're in the act of changing the environment. And they don't know the outcome of that because they can't predict the future. So that itself produces anxiety. If what they have created, whatever the outcome of that act is, if the group they live in tends to accept it, experimentally or for forever, it doesn't matter, if it produces meaning and prosperity, both of those things, meaning and prosperity for others, well, the anxiety is going to go down for that particular moment in time because they feel connected again. The freedom is led to some way of connecting. However, it's just as likely that it takes time and energy for anything to be accepted by a group, and it may not be accepted at all. And that raises and highlights the experience continues and highlights isolation from others. It highlights the possibility of futility, and all of that in the midst of being aware of space and time highlights and brings into existence more awareness of death. Death reminders is what that's called in terror management theory. And any one of these things are taken collectively, depending on time, space, and what is being created by a creative act. Any one of these things evokes anxiety. So anxiety goes hand in hand with creativity. And creativity is the reason for our existence. So creativity cannot exist if we haven't also evolved mechanisms to manage it. So anxiety demands management, or else we wouldn't be where we are as a species. Now, Murray Bowen comes into the picture here because he believes that successful management of anxiety is increased through what he calls the differentiating of the self within an intimate group. It's not doing away with the group, it's balancing the individuation that's necessary for survival with the participation in a group context, which is necessary for the result, the fruit of the creativity. And going back and forth in this, he uses the example of a seesaw, which I have a slide on in a minute, produces successful management of anxiety. And it yields more, going to the yellow point here, it yields more inclusion, more happiness, and wisdom may increase because you're learning, you're learning what to do in your particular culture, what counts, what manages anxiety, what is considered to be creative. You're learning this at the same time the culture is dynamic and changing just because of your own creativity. Both of these things go on because it's a cycle. If it doesn't, if it's unsuccessful management, then it will increase isolation. Your anxiety will increase. That may change to despair because you're feeling that this is going to go on forever, and that leads to despair, which leads to depression. But at any moment in time, you sort of can choose between whether this is producing more wisdom or more despair. And that determines what happens in the next cycle. And for us, therapy is about helping people break out of this cycle. Break out of the cycle, move, if they're into despair, move towards wisdom, learn what they need to be doing in this world to balance their relationship with other people. Now, continuing Murray Bowen for a minute, I'm just expanding on the differentiation of self. Basically, Bowen said that a person who is more self-differentiated has a greater balance between their thoughts and their feelings. This does not mean that the thoughts dominate the feelings. It means that the person is open to learning from their feelings, but feelings are in that sense a source of information. They're just not the only source of information. On an observable interpersonal level, they move between connection and disconnection from others. So they can move into disconnection for creative reasons, and they can move back into connection to enjoy the fruits of that creativity. Here's another way of looking at it. our social being keeps us grounded. If we don't get too bogged down and fused with other people. Individual being lets us soar. And self-differentiation means keeping a balance between these two. Then I want to move on to what happens in therapy. In therapy, we view the client as basically our contract with the client has to do with helping them get more of what they want and less of what they're not wanting. The client comes in fearful about that. That's what their desire. They want something, and they're afraid they're not going to get it, or they're getting something they really are afraid is going to continue and they don't want it. They're into that content. They focus on that, and this has an underlying anxiety. But the reason this anxiety, they can also be anxious about having anxiety. In any case, this anxiety is driven, from our point of view, by a more core anxiety. So our first interventions are particular to a person's family, a culture. We're interested in those things. If it's a different culture, we want to learn about that. It becomes part of the conversation. We learn from the client. But as therapy continues and we move down through this triangle, we're using more universal kinds of phenomena, things that we call them things that all people have in common, which is what I just went through with the cycle of creativity and wisdom. Because the core anxiety basically goes to the heart of not belonging in a family, a community, a society, or culture. That's what's at the heart of the psychosocial crisis in Erikson's developmental stages. It really boils down to what, Hamlet, to be or not to be. Is what you're doing and how you're being in the world increasing being in the world, or is the threat to being? Because non-being is what's really at the bottom of this, and it has to do with the fear of death. It's death anxiety driving everything above it. Finally, the technique we use to change this is, we believe, as Maslow here, that this therapy is not about telling people, what's going on in this respect. It's about recreating an experience of it. The experiential piece comes in, and it's not the only thing we use, but we use a lot of relational Gestalt work. So we have people move around. Here's an example of double chair, but it actually could be 4 or 5 chairs. And the person is taking their fears, they're putting them in one chair, maybe other fears about something else, another, maybe fear for their relationship with their parents and with other people. And they end up creating a dialogue among them. And then they finally replace the therapist in this chair, and they become their own therapist. That's an over exaggeration, but that is the goal. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Annie Thiel. She's going to describe a case or two, depending on our time here, that illustrates our work. So Annie, you want to talk about the marathons and going? Okay, go ahead.
Bill, thank you. Good evening, everyone. One of the cases that Bill and I worked in, our marathon therapy, that illustrates this model in a very accurate way, was a case in which a couple, along with their daughter, 16-year-old daughter, came to therapy wanting to try and solve some family problems, which really dealt with the daughter having been arrested for shoplifting and wearing an ankle bracelet for some time. She was very bright and had been accepted to a Eastern boarding school. She had to keep wearing the bracelet while on the airplane and later at the boarding school. But basically, the family was facing this as a crisis because they had been very fused throughout the girl's life, and they didn't know how they were going to handle this with her being gone and ashamed of her still wearing the ankle bracelet. So basically, I greeted them, Bill greeted them as they came in the door. The woman was Italian, and her name was Angelina. I've changed the names, of course, to keep confidentiality here. But her name was Angelina, and she introduced the girl as Mini-Me. She said, "This is Mini-Me. This is Gladys." And the father laughed. The father was a New England WASP. That's a abbreviation for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. They're very different in their cultural orientation. And as they began to take their seats, I could see that they were basically more enmeshed than usual patients that Bill and I have worked with. And as the dialogue continued and they began to share with us the basis of fusion in the family, we came to learn that the mother had had MS for all the years of the daughter's life, all 16 years. And they had spent most of their life going to doctors in this country and other countries, to Europe, to Latin America, many places, seeking help, always believing they could find help. The daughter's life was not as of much consequence except to be her mother's companion, to be the mini-me, to go with her mother. And the father, outside of his work, would communicate with both of them. But the whole focus of that family was to try and find a way to help the mother with the MS. As time went on, the girl began to act out and got into drugs and alcohol and ended up finally in shoplifting. Family was very shamed when she was caught shoplifting and had been in therapy as family therapy and then decided to do the marathon. Very often, Dr. Forche and I will have worked with a family and then come upon the decision to do a marathon with one of the families that we are working with as therapists. When they came into the room and began to talk about this, the way their life had been lived, to find a solution to the MS, I could see that the daughter was becoming increasingly anxious. And Bill had noticed this too. And at a certain point, when it seemed like the appropriate point, Bill invited them to do the chair work in Gestalt therapy. The daughter agreed with this, but as she took the chair, instead of continuing to talk as we had formerly about her mother's health and the survival of her mother and her own guilt over giving stress to her mother through her adolescent behavior, she suddenly exploded. And she said to Bill, "I'm angry at God. I'm angry at God." And as Bill talked with her, he decided to play the role of God. And the girl was able to really give all of her frustration and anxiety and pain into talking to God. As the Gestalt went on, the mother took the girl's place and Bill worked with her regarding her enmeshment with the daughter, the fusion with the daughter, and the blindness to letting the daughter individuate, which according to human development takes place around this age when the adolescent begins to individuate from the parent and develop their own self, their own life, their own path. This therapy really evoked changes. The daughter's act of creativity and Bill's act of creativity in doing the God chair work with the daughter gave the daughter a kind of freedom and a feeling of being individuated. Further, as the day wore on, we do usually 6 hours of a day with the marathon therapy. The mother began to realize that having a mini-me was precluding her daughter from growing up and feeling a kind of self-actualization and independence and individuation. The father finally did the chair work and realized he had an understanding of what was going on, but that he had too much anxiety about his wife's health to interfere or intervene. The final conclusion of this case was that the daughter continued to go away to boarding school, but with a new attitude, not that she was being punished or that she couldn't be a part of the family system because of her shoplifting, but because it was the right thing to do that was right for this family, that she could have freedom and individuation, and the whole family could have prosperity for all. Where they had had an isolation and futility and a constant death awareness of thinking the mother would die at any time, she actually had garnered some control over the MS with the right medication. The daughter was able to go away, and the daughter was able to manage her anxiety about her own behavior by realizing that the family had fused together about this one core anxiety, and they were able to let go through the Gestalt work. They were able to manage the anxiety. They had successful management. As time went on, because usually Bill and I do check on to see how patients are doing past the Marathon therapy, they decided to have a second session. In this session, the daughter was a typical adolescent who was starting to date and have fun at school and enjoy her coursework. The parents were proud of her that she was beginning to lead her own life and had developed a keen awareness and excitement of what it would be to be in the field of photography. She'd even written to National Geographic, wanting to know what it would take if she got out of college to be a photographer and writer. And she began to look at the past in which they had gone to the doctor's offices and see instead the places she traveled and she'd like to go there again as an individuated person. They were a different family. And I really believe that the Gestalt work was the healing that took place.